Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 5 of the preseason for the San Jose Sharks, in which they took on the Vegas Golden Knights and won by a score of 2-0. Before getting into the roster for tonight's game, I do want to mention that this was likely the Sharks' best preseason game thus far in this short stint of games. While the offense wasn't fully there with just 2 goals on the board, the defense really locked things down and didn't really let the Golden Knights generate much of anything. Now, it should obviously be noted that while the Sharks aren't icing an exact replica of their starting lineup for the season, they are relatively close to it, while the Golden Knights are obviously quite far, with still players like Marchessault, William Karlsson, Mark Stone, Jack Eichel all not playing in tonight's game. So it wasn't exactly an extremely difficult challenge to shut down this Golden Knights team, but at the end of the day, it was still good to see the Sharks put up a very solid 2-0 win effort, even if it was in the preseason. Moving on to the lineup, obviously some massive changes considering the fact that just yesterday the Sharks made a ton of roster cuts, and so we are getting very, very close now at this point to a starting roster. If there were not for a few injuries currently that are on the Sharks group with players like Mikael Granlund, Kevin Labanc, and Logan Couture, we probably would have gotten an even closer lineup, and we should expect something like that on Thursday for the final preseason game of the year. But here tonight, still a decent look at things, and taking a look at this first line, we have Barabanov, Sturm, and Zadina. Starting off with Barabanov, it's his 3rd preseason game of the year. The first 2 I thought were a big struggle for him. He looked extremely rusty and just not particularly good at all, which wasn't a huge issue, of course, because Barabanov is already a semi-established NHL player, so it's not as though he had to put up a great performance, but it's obviously still nice to see. And here tonight, at the very least, he did turn things around. This was a very good game for Barabanov. Definitely looked like the player that we have come to know from him over these past couple of years. Great stick handling, great puck movement, just generally some solid passes. And so a very nice game for Barabanov for sure. He was centered by Nico Sturm here tonight on the first line. Sturm, also playing his 3rd preseason game, also struggled right out of the gate with a pretty bad performance in game 1, but has definitely been better as of late, and certainly looks in regular season form at this point, especially since he's not going to be called on to play the first line role, obviously, for the Sharks, and likely more falling into the 3rd or perhaps even 4th line position, which he's definitely ready for. When it comes to the last player on this line, that would of course be Filip Zadina, and I don't think many people would disagree with the fact that Zadina has had a solid preseason and training camp. He's been doing a lot of the right things, not just offensively, but also defensively. However, at the end of the day, when you want to be a top 6 forward, you do actually have to start producing points, and Zadina just hasn't really been doing that. Then this is not a case where Zadina's been getting great chances everywhere, but it's just entirely snake-bitten. But even though he's been doing some solid things offensively, none of it is exactly leading to great chances on net. And so he's currently in the top 6 for this preseason lineup, but as I mentioned, multiple injuries are keeping other potential top 6 players out of the lineup at this point. Couture obviously going to be in the top 6. Hurdle sat this one out, not due to injury, but just generally sitting it out. He's definitely going to be in the top 6. Players like Hoffman, Granlund, Labanc, not in tonight's lineup, definitely are top 6 options. So Zadina, if you want to be in this role, you have to be putting up the points, and it just hasn't really come just yet. So we'll see exactly how the final preseason game goes, if he's still in the lineup for that, and then how the regular season will start off and where he will find himself in the lineup. When it comes to the second line, of course, I mentioned in the previous preseason game that seeing the duo of Eklund and Bordeleau paired with Cunnin was pretty exciting, just because Eklund and Bordeleau together is quite cool to watch. Here tonight, we probably had an even more exciting trio, with Eklund and Bordeleau instead being joined by Quentin Musty, making his NHL preseason debut. Was injured for the first few games, and so even though we are getting closer and closer to a regular season lineup, David Quinn wanted to give Musty at least one game here in the preseason to give him a chance to experience what that NHL game is like before being sent back to juniors. I think that was a very nice move by David Quinn, and putting him in a position to succeed at that, also quite cool to see. Musty was solid enough I would say tonight. Obviously, nobody was really expecting him to be able to make the team out of training camp, and especially with the injury that kept him out for a while, it was going to be practically impossible unless he had an absolutely spectacular game here tonight, which he did not have. But he did some solid things, had some very good reads, made some solid plays. He did take a few extra liberties that he could definitely afford to get away with at the junior level, but something that's going to be much more difficult for him to pull off at the NHL level, and he likely learned that here tonight. But it was a good sort of first step towards getting to the NHL, and it'll likely be an experience that he will keep in his mind as he plays through the upcoming junior season and perhaps look to make the team next year. When it comes to the other two players on this line, the two players who are much closer to actually being able to make the San Jose Sharks, we have Eklund, who had a pretty solid game. Obviously, he had that absolutely amazing pass to Thomas Bordeleau for the first and game-winning goal of this one. That was definitely nice to see. He continues to be an absolutely amazing penalty killer, which I feel as though just kind of came out of nowhere, and yet he's just been absolutely outstanding. That's probably one of the biggest things that is working in his favor to actually be able to make the team out of training camp, because he can be such a spectacular penalty killer for the San Jose Sharks. Didn't really get to work too much on the power play here tonight, got very little time in that regard, but at even strength made up a solid enough line for the San Jose Sharks. And so it is the mark of a good NHL player where even on a day where you're not exactly playing amazingly and you're not just dominating the ice, you can still make an impact on the board, and that's exactly what Eklund managed to do with his outstanding pass, his assist goal onto Bordeleau's chance. And then when it comes to the aforementioned Thomas Bordeleau, kind of similar to Eklund in this regard, also had a pretty solid game. A lot of credit obviously does have to go to Eklund for that amazing pass, but it should also be given some credit to Bordeleau for being able to handle that one and actually be able to put it in. It wasn't as much of a tap-in as you might expect, so kudos still to Bordeleau, who had a pretty good game. Doesn't have that same penalty-killing edge as Eklund, which will allow Eklund to likely be able to make the team out of training camp. Bordeleau going to be a bit closer in the weeds with some of the other players here vying for a lineup spot, but we'll exactly see how things look come a couple of days from now on Thursday for the Sharks' final preseason game, if Bordeleau will actually be able to make the cut. When it comes to the third line, we have Peterson, Lindblom, and Zetterlund, a line of players who were definitely looking to have good preseasons here because they're kind of on the outside looking in. Peterson not as much, but with the preseason performance he has had thus far, he kind of is now at this point on the outside looking in, and none of these three players necessarily impressed me all that much here tonight. Zetterlund, I thought he had some good puck movement on the power play. That was probably one of the best parts for the San Jose Sharks on the power play here tonight. It wasn't the Eklund power play unit, but it was the Barabanov power play unit featuring him, Jacob McDonald, Zetterlund, these players. They had some fantastic puck movement to be able to get pucks out of high pressure situations and allow for eventually that Jacob McDonald goal, the only other goal of this game. And so Zetterlund had positives there, but at even strength, honestly didn't really do too much, and that's a bit of an issue considering he didn't really do too much of anything for the Sharks at all at the end of last season. So he's just been kind of a pretty type of player for San Jose ever since they acquired him, and I'm not sure how long he'll actually be able to remain in the lineup doing pretty much nothing for San Jose. And those similar feelings are echoed when talking about Oskar Lindblom as well, just not really doing much of anything in these games for both of these players. So if there are indeed players who are looking to get axed from the starting lineup going into this next season, Zetterlund and Lindblom seem to be primary candidates for that. And then finally, when it comes to Jacob Peterson, I do think he was the best player of this three. He definitely had the better game on this line. Still not amazing, still not exactly where we want it to be from what we saw from him last season, but definitely beginning to get there and definitely worth giving another shot in the final preseason game of this season. When it comes to the fourth line, I do once again want to start with Givani Smith, playing in his third preseason game. In his first two, I was pretty quick to praise him for his performance, and I am again going to do that here in this third game. The one fault of Giovanni Smith's game that he does need to get under control is those penalties. A couple of unnecessary penalties here tonight for sure. It's difficult the role that he plays. You do kind of have to walk that line, but you can't keep crossing it multiple times per game because you're going to end up being more of a drag to your team compared to a boon for them. But when it comes to that playing that physical style of role, the Sharks have had many players in their franchise in the past who have tried to fill in this role. But one thing that they have always usually had in common is that even though they bring a physical aspect to the game, they weren't ever particularly great at actually playing hockey. You know, recently looking at a player like Jeff Viel, or prior to that Michael Haley, or prior to that a whole list of players, as of course the NHL back in the early 2010s and all the way before that were much more willing to include these enforcer type players into the lineup. These days they're much more rare. You do usually have to actually be able to play hockey because the Michael Haleys and the Jeff Viels of the league will eventually just sort of get pushed out by actual skilled players. But Giovanni Smith manages to combine both of those things. He's a very physically imposing presence on the ice who can just completely run over players, which we saw a couple of times this game and multiple times this preseason, but also very good in front of the net and making things happen offensively. Obviously not at that level where you'd put him in the top 6, for sure not, but he looks like he can be that type of fourth line player that the Sharks can get a full 82 game season out of and be pretty happy with that. It wouldn't honestly surprise me to see Giovanni Smith actually put up maybe even 10 goals here this season. And 10 goals, you might not think that's particularly impressive, but for a fourth liner who's likely not going to be getting much more than like 10 minutes per night, that would be quite good. And he was joined on his line by Ryan Carpenter and Justin Bailey. Bailey was sent down in yesterday's preseason cuts, but due to some injuries of players not being able to play, he was actually brought back up to fill in for tonight's game. Didn't necessarily make too much of an impact. He was pretty good, but not all that great. Meanwhile, Ryan Carpenter, the center on this line, really didn't do much of anything. When it comes to the defensive side of things, we had the first pairing of Kyle Burroughs and Henry Thrun. Thrun, a very steady game as he continues to try and make that push to be on the starting lineup for the San Jose Sharks this season. It remains to be seen exactly how things will actually land defensively for the Sharks. It remains to be seen as well as how serious the injury to both players like Shemek and Jan Ruta are. At this point, the Sharks made an acquisition on the waiver wire to pick up Ty Emberson from the New York Rangers recently, which could perhaps be an indication for how serious Ruta's injury ended up actually being, because he was a right-handed defenseman who could replace that player. And so if we're taking a look at the lineup for the defensemen for the San Jose Sharks, you've got players like Ferraro, Vlasic, Burroughs, and perhaps McDonald. Of course, Matt Benning is in there as well. And then are you getting Thrun in there? Gavanka, Knyzhov, a lot of different options for the San Jose Sharks. Thrun definitely giving himself a very, very good chance of being able to make that team and perhaps even be the #1 power play guy, by the way, considering he has filled in that role every single game he has played thus far, not only in the preseason, but even going back to the rookie face-off tournament. And of course, his defensive partner, like I mentioned, Kyle Burroughs, a decent game for him tonight, rather solid defensive defenseman there, and so not really much else to say. When it comes to the second pairing, we have Leon Gavanka, who's playing his second preseason game of the year. His first one was pretty disappointing for a player who was absolutely desperate to be playing in the NHL this season, was willing to just head to Germany because the Winnipeg Jets weren't giving him the time of day. You were thinking he would come out with a better performance. Well, here tonight he absolutely did. His first period at the very least was really, really impressive and definitely a fantastic audition to be able to make the team going into this next season. But after the first period, it felt as though things definitely quieted down a bit for Gavanka, so I'm not sure if he pushed the needle enough for David Quinn to feel the need to put him in that starting roster come game 1. The same would go for Nikolai Knyzhov, who I thought also had a pretty solid game here tonight, but again, I don't know if he did enough to actually be able to make the starting lineup. There are just so many players at this point who can actually fill into these particular roles, and it's very difficult to actually come to a decision. It's something that David Quinn is going to have to think about for a while. And then when it comes to the bottom pairing here tonight, we had Emberson making his San Jose Sharks debut. As I mentioned, picked up off of waivers from the New York Rangers, a right-handed defenseman at that, filling in for the injured Jan Ruda. As I mentioned, we do not know how long he is out for, but Emberson definitely can fill in that role. Emberson, I thought, also had a very strong start to this game. His first period, he made definitely an impact in his first period as a San Jose Shark, but as the game went on, slowed down a bit. Definitely ended up being a bit more of a defensive guy. Some issues I noticed in his game. Got walked a bit one time on the penalty kill for the San Jose Sharks, which was a bit awkward. But as a right-handed defenseman, even though the Sharks have a ton of defensemen in the lineup, not many of them are right-handed, so there's a bit of slim picking, so he might be able to squeeze into the starting lineup anyhow. And then the final defenseman to talk about would obviously be Jacob McDonald here. He did score a goal. He is still managing to show himself as an effective offensive player for the San Jose Sharks, but some issues continue to remain defensively for Jacob McDonald, so I don't know if he'll actually be able to make it. It's really just been the general theme here for pretty much every single Sharks defenseman in the lineup tonight, besides maybe Kyle Burrows, who is likely a lock. It's just who is indeed going to be penciled in for Game 1. And then finally, to mention the goaltender, I don't have it written down here, but that ended up being Kaapo Kähkönen. No surprise there. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if on Thursday it would be Mackenzie Blackwood getting the final start of the preseason. Kähkönen, in his first game of the preseason, also against the Golden Knights, looked pretty good. Not great, but pretty good. Here tonight, also quite solid. Obviously, the shutout didn't let in a single goal, wasn't exactly challenged all that much, but still a couple of times and a couple of very nice saves that he did indeed have to make. So this is a nice confidence-building type of game for Kaapo Kähkönen heading into this upcoming regular season. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday for their 6th and final preseason game. David Quinn has mentioned that the lineup for that preseason game is going to look very, very similar to what the actual regular season lineup will look like, and so we look forward to that. Class dismissed.